They said she was nothing, not worth a name, not worth a future, not even worth the air she breathed. But the day her own father tried to sell her like cattle in the middle of a dusty frontier town, a lone cowboy stepped forward and made a choice that would change both their lives forever. Though no one watching that moment in Dustfall Ridge could have guessed just how deeply fate was about to cut. The sun burned mercilessly overhead, casting long, cruel shadows across the cracked earth as townsfolk gathered outside the saloon, drawn not by kindness but by curiosity. Because in the West, tragedy was a form of entertainment, and today's spectacle was Eliza Boone, the once proud daughter of a struggling rancher who had fallen so far that even pity had abandoned her. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hands scraped raw, and her eyes hollow from nights spent wondering how a father's love could rot into something so cold and unrecognizable. Yet there she stood, trembling but upright, as her father, Henry Boone, a man hollowed out by debt, whiskey, and bitterness, faced a heavy-set stranger with a gold watch chain and a smile that never reached his eyes, the kind of man who didn't buy land so much as he consumed it, along with anything, or anyone, attached to it. And the murmurs in the crowd made it clear everyone knew exactly what kind of transaction was about to take place. "She's all I've got left," Henry slurred, though there was no affection in his voice, only calculation. "Ain't worth much, but she'll do what she's told." And Eliza flinched, not because the words were new, but because they were being spoken out loud now. Stripped of any last illusion, she might have clung to that somewhere. Buried beneath the anger and the drink, her father still saw her as his daughter instead of a debt to be settled. The stranger stepped closer, eyeing her like livestock, circling once as if inspecting a horse, his boots crunching against gravel, and Eliza fought the urge to shrink back, forcing her spine straight even as shame burned through her veins, because if this was the moment her life was to be decided, she would not meet it on her knees. "Teeth look fine," the man muttered, reaching for her chin, but she jerked away, and that single act of defiance snapped whatever fragile patience her father had left, his hand striking her across the face with a crack that echoed through the street, silencing the whispers for just a heartbeat before they returned, softer now, edged with discomfort that no one was brave enough to act on. Eliza staggered, the taste of blood blooming in her mouth. But she didn't fall, and when she looked back at him, there was something new in her gaze. Not fear, not even anger, but a quiet, breaking realization that the man before her was no longer her father in any way that mattered. "Don't you dare embarrass me," Henry growled, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "You do as you're told, or you're out on the street with nothing." And the words hummed there, heavy and final, because everyone knew what nothing meant out here. It meant hunger, danger, and a slow, lonely death under an indifferent sky. The stranger chuckled low in his throat, clearly amused, clearly interested in the transaction more than the girl herself, and he reached into his coat, pulling out a folded stack of bills that made Henry's eyes light up with a greed so naked it turned Eliza's stomach, because this was it, the moment she would be traded away like a broken tool, her future decided by men who had never once cared whether she lived or died. "I won't go," she said, her voice shaking but audible, and that single sentence rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water, because refusal was not something women in her position were allowed. Not here, not ever. Henry's grip tightened, his face twisting with fury, and for a second it looked like he might strike her again, but instead he laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that held no humor at all. "Hear that?" he sneered, looking around as if inviting the town to witness her defiance. "Girl thinks she's got a choice." And then, louder, colder, for all to hear, he added the words that would follow her like a shadow long after this day was over. "You ain't worth choosing, Eliza. You ain't worth anything." And with that, he shoved her forward so hard she stumbled into the dirt, her knees hitting the ground as dust rose around her in a choking cloud, her vision blurring not just from pain, but from the crushing weight of humiliation. Because this wasn't just abandonment. It was erasure, a declaration that she had no value, no place, no right to exist beyond what someone else decided she was worth. For a long moment, no one moved. The entire town frozen in that uneasy space between witnessing cruelty and pretending it wasn't their responsibility. And then, just as the stranger stepped forward again, reaching as if to claim what he believed he had already bought. A new sound cut through the tension. The slow, steady creak of leather and the soft thud of boots hitting dirt, and every head turned toward the edge of the street where a lone rider had just dismounted, his silhouette framed against the blazing sky, hat pulled low, shoulders broad, presence quiet but impossible to ignore. Colt Maddox had arrived without announcement, like he always did, a man known more by reputation than words, someone who kept to himself, worked his land, and avoided trouble with a consistency that had become almost legendary. But now he stood there, taking in the scene with a gaze that missed nothing: the bruised girl in the dirt, the father counting money that wasn't yet his, the crowd that watched and did nothing. And something in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if the story everyone thought they were witnessing had just been interrupted by something far less predictable. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice, didn't even reach for the gun at his side. But when he stepped forward, the crowd parted instinctively, because men like Colt didn't need to announce themselves. They carried a weight that others felt without understanding. And when he stopped a few feet from Eliza, his shadow falling over her like a shield against the relentless sun, he finally spoke, his voice low, steady, and sharper than any blade. "If she's worthless to you," he said, his eyes never leaving Henry Boone's face, "then I'll take what nobody else wants." And in that moment, with dust still clinging to her skin and the sting of her father's words echoing in her ears, Eliza Boone looked up at a stranger who saw her not as a burden, not as a debt, not as something to be traded or discarded, but as something worth choosing. And though she didn't know it yet, that single choice was about to rewrite everything she thought she knew about herself, about survival, and about the kind of love that could rise from the harshest corners of the Wild West. The man who had claimed her in front of an entire town as if defying the very idea that she was worthless did not speak another word as he helped her to her feet. And that silence, steady, unpressured, almost careful, was the first thing that unsettled Eliza Boone as Colt Maddox led her away from Dustfall Ridge, because she had expected demands, or questions, or at the very least some explanation for why a stranger would step into a situation that could easily turn violent. But instead there was only the rhythmic creak of his saddle, the soft crunch of hooves against dry earth, and the strange, almost unbearable feeling that she had just crossed an invisible line between the life she had known and something she could not yet understand. The town shrank behind them quickly, swallowed by distance and heat shimmer, and still Colt said nothing, only glancing back once to make sure she hadn't fallen behind, his eyes sharp but not unkind, as if measuring not her worth, but her condition. And when her steps faltered for the third time, he stopped without comment, unhooked a canteen from his saddle, and held it out to her, not forcing it into her hands, not even stepping closer than necessary, just offering it as though the choice to accept it still belonged to her. Eliza hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for it, because kindness, real kindness, not the kind that came with strings attached, had become something foreign, something she no longer knew how to trust. Yet the water was cool and clean, and as she drank, she realized just how desperately she had needed it, the dryness in her throat easing enough for her to finally find her voice. "Why?" she asked, the word barely more than a whisper, but it stopped him all the same. Colt turning slightly, his gaze settling on her with a quiet steadiness that made it impossible to look away, and for a moment it seemed like he might not answer at all, as though the question itself didn't require one. But then he shrugged, a small, almost reluctant motion. "Didn't like the way they looked at you," he said simply, as if that explained everything, and maybe, in his mind, it did. The answer wasn't what she expected. There was no grand declaration, no claim of obligation or righteousness, just a blunt truth that somehow carried more weight than anything else he could have said. And before she could press further, he had already turned back toward the trail, adjusting the reins and starting forward again, leaving her to follow with more questions than before, but a strange, fragile thread of something else weaving through her thoughts, something dangerously close to hope. By the time they reached his ranch, the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in streaks of amber and gold that stretched across the wide, open land like a promise the world wasn't entirely cruel. and Eliza found herself staring despite everything. Because the place before her was nothing like the broken homestead she had grown up in. It was strong, solid, alive, a house built with intention and care, surrounded by fenced pastures where cattle grazed lazily and a windmill turned steadily against the horizon, its quiet rhythm echoing the kind of life that endured rather than collapsed under pressure. Colt dismounted first, tying off his horse before turning back to her, offering a hand without a word, and when she took it, the contact was brief but grounding, his grip firm without being possessive, as though he understood exactly how much, or how little, touch she could bear, and once she was steady, he stepped back immediately, giving her space again as he gestured toward the house. "You can stay here," he said, his tone as matter-of-fact as everything else about him. "Room's clean, food's inside." And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "You don't owe me anything." The words landing heavier than they should have, because they contradicted everything Eliza had been taught about survival, that nothing was free, that every act of kindness carried a price waiting to be collected. But Colt didn't linger to make sure she believed him, didn't stand there expecting gratitude or obedience. He simply picked up a bucket near the well and walked off toward the barn, leaving her alone in the quiet space between uncertainty and possibility. The days that followed were not easy, but they were different, and that difference mattered more than Eliza could have imagined, because Colt never treated her like something fragile that needed to be fixed, nor like a burden he regretted taking on. He treated her like someone who had the right to exist in his space without explanation, and that simple, radical notion began to rebuild something inside her that had been broken long before Dustfall Ridge. He rose before dawn each morning, working the land with a focus that spoke of years spent relying on no one but himself. Yet he always left food where she could find it, always made sure there was water drawn and firewood stacked, small acts that spoke louder than any words he could have offered. And when she began to help, tentatively at first, sweeping the porch, tending to the small kitchen garden, he didn't stop her or praise her, just nodded once as if acknowledging that she had chosen to stay rather than been told to, and that quiet recognition settled something restless in her chest. It was on the 5th day that she found the horse, a wild, restless creature kept separate from the others, its dark coat gleaming with untamed energy as it paced the edge of its enclosure. And something about it drew her closer, perhaps because she recognized the same defiance in its eyes, the same refusal to be broken no matter how many times the world tried. And without thinking, she stepped into the pen, ignoring the warning stamped into every instinct she had, her hand reaching out slowly, patiently, offering not control but presence. And for a long, breathless moment, the horse stilled, its ears flicking forward as it considered her, before lowering its head just enough to brush against her palm. "That one throws everyone." Colt's voice came from behind her, low but edged with surprise, and she turned to find him watching from the gate, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Yet there was something there, something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of recognition, of respect, perhaps even something deeper that he didn't yet know how to name. "Maybe it just didn't like being forced," Eliza replied softly, her hand still resting against the horse's neck, and for the first time since he had brought her here, Colt let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a laugh, though it was rough and used, like a sound he had forgotten how to make. That night, as they sat on opposite ends of the porch, the silence between them no longer heavy but shared, Eliza realized something that both frightened and steadied her in equal measure. This man hadn't saved her in the way stories claimed men were supposed to, hadn't swept her away or demanded her loyalty in return for his protection. Instead, he had given her something far more dangerous, far more powerful, the space to become someone who didn't need saving at all. And as the stars stretched wide across the endless sky, she understood that whatever this was between them, it wasn't born from pity or obligation. It was something slower, stronger, built in quiet moments and unspoken understanding. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eliza Boone began to believe that maybe, just maybe, her father had been wrong. The past did not knock politely when it returned. It came riding hard across the open land in a storm of dust and vengeance, shattering the fragile peace Eliza Boone had begun to build at Colt Maddox's ranch. and the first sign of it was the distant thunder of hoofs cutting through the stillness of a late afternoon that had, until then, felt almost gentle. Eliza stood near the corral, her hand resting on the once wild horse that now trusted her enough to stand still beneath her touch. When she saw them crest the ridge, 3 riders, silhouettes dark against the burning sky, and even before her mind caught up, her body recognized the danger. Her breath hitching as something cold and familiar coiled in her chest, because she knew, in the way a person knows a storm before it breaks, that her old life had found her again. Colt appeared at her side without a word, his presence steady but different now, sharper, coiled, like a man who had buried something dangerous deep inside himself and was being forced to dig it back up. And as the riders approached, the details came into focus, turning dread into certainty. The heavy-set land baron with his smug, predatory smile, 2 hired guns flanking him, and riding just behind them, thinner, meaner, and somehow more hollow than before, was Henry Boone, her father, his eyes locking onto her with a cold satisfaction that made her stomach turn. "Told you she'd run to someone foolish enough to take her in," Henry called out as they reined in near the fence, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Problem is, she weren't mine to give away for free." And the land baron dismounted slowly, brushing dust from his coat as if this were a business meeting rather than an invasion, producing folded papers from his pocket with a flourish meant to impress or intimidate, likely both. "Signed agreement," he said smoothly, holding them up. "Your father here made a deal, and I don't much care if the merchandise walked off before delivery." And the word merchandise hit harder than any blow Eliza had ever taken, not because it was new, but because it was being spoken again, right here, in the place she had begun to believe was hers, turning her safe haven into just another battleground. Colt stepped forward then, placing himself between them and Eliza without hesitation, his voice low but edged with steel. "She ain't property," he said, each word deliberate, final, but the hired guns shifted at that, hands hovering near their holsters, and the air tightened with the kind of tension that only ended one way out here. "Careful," one of them muttered, "this don't concern you." But Colt didn't move, didn't even glance their way, his focus locked on the man who had come to claim something they had no right to, and behind him, Eliza felt something shift inside her. Not fear this time, not helplessness, but something stronger, something that had been growing quietly since the day he had brought her here and simply let her exist. "It concerns me," she said, stepping forward before Colt could stop her, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, and all eyes turned to her, surprise flickering across faces that had expected silence, submission, compliance, anything but this. Henry laughed, a bitter, mocking sound. "Still pretending you've got a say in things?" he sneered. "You're still the same worthless girl, Eliza. Don't matter where you run." And there it was again, the word that had once crushed her, stripped her of everything she believed about herself. But this time, it didn't land the same way, because she wasn't the same person who had fallen into the dirt in Dustfall Ridge, and she proved it in the next breath. "The only worthless thing here," she said, her gaze locking onto his without flinching, "is the man who threw away his own daughter." And the silence that followed was sharper than any gunshot, cutting through the tension with a force no one had expected, least of all Henry, whose expression twisted with something between rage and disbelief, as though the idea that she could stand against him had never even occurred to him. The land baron scoffed, clearly losing patience. "I didn't ride all this way for a family argument," he snapped, gesturing to his men. "Take her." And everything happened at once after that, the hired guns moving, Colt stepping forward, the crack of a gunshot splitting the air before anyone fully registered who had drawn first, and then the world narrowed into chaos, dust kicking up beneath frantic movement, the sharp smell of gunpowder burning through the heat as Colt moved with a speed that felt almost unreal, the quiet cowboy gone, replaced by something precise and lethal, something honed by a past he had never spoken of but had never truly left behind. One of the hired guns went down first, his weapon knocked from his hand before he could fire a second shot, the other hesitating just long enough for Colt to turn on him, the message clear without words, leave or fall, and the man chose survival, scrambling back toward his horse, while the land baron cursed, backing away as the situation slipped from his control. Henry, however, didn't retreat, his desperation outweighing his sense, his hand going for his gun in a last, foolish attempt to reclaim authority over a life he had already lost. But Eliza saw it before anyone else, saw the movement, the intent, and in that split second, she understood something with absolute clarity. This was the moment that would define everything, not Colt's actions, not the outcome of the fight, but hers. "Don't," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos, and for just a heartbeat, Henry froze, not out of obedience, but out of shock, because she had never spoken to him like that before, never stood between him and what he wanted, and that hesitation was enough for Colt to step in, enough for the situation to end without another shot fired, the standoff collapsing into a tense, fragile stillness where the outcome was finally clear. "It's over," Colt said, his voice calm again but no less dangerous. "You got no claim here." And the land baron, calculating as ever, seemed to realize it too, his eyes flicking between the fallen gun, the unyielding man in front of him, and the woman who refused to be taken, and whatever profit he had hoped to gain no longer outweighed the risk. "This ain't finished," he muttered, though there was no conviction left in it, and with a sharp gesture, he turned, mounting his horse and riding off, his remaining man following quickly behind, leaving Henry alone in the aftermath of his own failure. For a long moment, he just stood there, looking at Eliza as if seeing her for the first time, not as something to control, not as a burden, but as someone who had slipped entirely beyond his reach. And whatever he saw there made him falter, the anger draining out of him, leaving only something small and hollow in its place. "You'll regret this," he said finally, but the words sounded weak, empty, and Eliza shook her head, a quiet, final gesture that carried more weight than any argument. "No," she replied, "I won't." And that was the end of it. Not with a gunshot, not with revenge, but with a choice, her choice, to walk away from the man who had once defined her worth and claim something better for herself. When Henry turned and left, there was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, just a strange, steady calm, like a door closing on a life she no longer belonged to. And when she finally looked back at Colt, standing there with the weight of what he had nearly become still lingering in his posture, she saw the question in his eyes, the unspoken doubt, the fear that he had only proven himself as dangerous as the world she had escaped, and she answered it without hesitation, stepping toward him, her voice softer now, but no less certain. "You didn't save me," she said, and his expression tightened slightly, as if bracing for something he expected but didn't want to hear. But then she continued, "You gave me the chance to save myself," and something in him shifted at that, something heavy easing just enough to let something else take its place, something quieter, steadier, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability he had kept buried until now. "You sure you want this?" he asked, gesturing faintly to the land, to himself, to the life that came with both. "I ain't exactly easy to live with." And Eliza smiled then, not the fragile, uncertain smile of someone trying to survive, but the sure, grounded smile of someone who had already made her choice. "You were the only one who saw I was worth anything," she said, and that was enough, more than enough, because what they built after that wasn't born from desperation or rescue, but from something far stronger, a shared understanding of what it meant to be broken and still choose to stand, to build, to love anyway. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that was now, undeniably, theirs, the story that had begun with rejection ended not in vengeance, but in something far more powerful. A woman who refused to be defined by the people who had tried to destroy her, and a man who chose her, not because she needed saving, but because she was worth everything.